Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Forensic Psychiatric Evaluation of Emotional Distress Claims in Employment Discrimination Cases, using Psychiatric Experts Wisely. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law since the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship, where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Dr. Kleinman will discuss assessment of emotional distress, methodology, prognosis, objective, subjective, the reasonable person, malingering, and misattribution, advanced issues, psychological testing, assistance with investigation, and legal basis for damage claims. To give you a little background about our presenter, Dr. Stuart Kleinman is a psychiatrist certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology in Psychiatry and Forensic Psychiatry and is an associate clinical professor of psychiatry at the Columbia Union College of Physicians and Surgeons. Dr. Kleinman possesses specialized expertise in the field of traumatic stress. He has served as medical director of the Crime Victim Center, where he oversaw the treatment of those suffering from the psychological consequences of trauma, and as an independent consultant both to the New York State Crime Victims Board, determining the role of criminal victimization and producing evaluating psychological difficulties, and to the Queens District Attorney's Special Victims Bureau, assisting in determining the psychological safety of children testifying in the presence of their alleged abusers. Dr. Kleinman's long-time experience working with those who have suffered serious assaults and threats provided him with a deep nuisance appreciation of PTSD and the use and misuse of this diagnosis. Attendees who require passcode, the word for today is psychiatric. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter the passcode into the Q&A widget for CL reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes of this presentation. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Kleinman will answer all questions at the end of this program. Thank you all for attending today, and Dr. Kleinman, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and in less than 1 hour, we will attempt to review a great deal of material. The slides that I've presented essentially represent a year-long course that I teach each year to fellows, those who are psychiatrists who are specifically training in the area of forensic psychiatry, so that what I will try to do is highlight what I hope will be particularly salient points to how many of you practice. So why don't we start with slide number 2, which is little cartoon. So if we can advance to that, Rochelle, please. I'll give everybody a moment to read it. Let's go back to slide 2. Slide 2 should be, in case it's not clear on my computer, I'll just read it out loud to make sure. There it is. If an employer wants to create a legal action or increase the likelihood of a legal action, this and one subsequent cartoon that I'll show are good ways to do so. People bring legal actions, as you all know, for many reasons, but people are particularly prone to do so when they feel narcissistically diminished, which is a fancy way of saying disrespected, demeaned, not appreciated. So let's go to slide number 3. which is a slide regarding essentially the two types of questions that a forensic psychiatrist can particularly assist in answering. The first, which is the more classic, is the issue of damages. Did the alleged wrongdoing produce any kind of psychiatric disorders? If so, what are the disorders? And what is both their severity and their prognosis? There is a fairly standard, generally accepted forensic psychiatric methodology for reliably answering this question, which we will address the outlines of. The second issue, which is more subtle, really is causation. Of course, it's up to the trier of fact to determine whether the alleged wrong or wrongs in fact occurred. And forensic psychiatrists and psychologists sometimes make the cardinal error of inadvertently assigning themselves the position of trier of fact and determining whether or not, for example, the alleged harassment occurred. Obviously, that whether it occurred is a fundamental question of fact. However, a forensic psychiatrist or a psychologist can sometimes help explain and understand why an individual seems to experience genuine distress, perhaps particular types of psychiatric disorders, even if what is alleged did not in fact occur. Or to put it another way, often there will be an assumption that if someone is suffering in a way that appears to be genuine, what the person asserts as the cause of such must in fact have occurred, because otherwise, why would the particular condition or conditions be present? The short answer to why it is possible for genuine psychiatric problems to arise in the absence of claimed wrongdoing is that how an individual perceives their environment and particular experiences in that environment may as much as, if not more than, the objective characteristics of the environment. In other words, what in fact occurred, how someone perceives and interprets and determine their mental state as much as, if not more than, what in fact occurs. So if someone perceives themselves, for example, as a function of a particular kind of disorder, or perhaps because of suffering past trauma, which creates certain distortions or biases, the perception of being mistreated can just as powerfully, in some instances, create distress, even a disorder, as in fact being mistreated in the way that is alleged. Now, of course, to say what is obvious yet important, it's always possible that a person was, in fact, objectively mistreated, and in addition to that, they perceived that objective mistreatment in a particular kind of way, which subsequently exaggerates the level of distress that they otherwise would feel. We'll come back to that, but the primary point is that forensic psychiatrists really can potentially assess two issues. One is damages, and the other potentially is causation. Let's move to slide number 4, which is the slide regarding PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is very commonly misunderstood, not only by non-mental health professionals, but unfortunately by mental health professionals as well. This isn't to talk today specifically about PTSD. I just want to make sure that before we finish today, everybody understands that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is not inherently a worse disorder than any kind of other disorder. Because post-traumatic stress disorder obviously incorporates in its name trauma, sometimes the impression is given that a person must have been psychologically traumatized to a particular extent. The fact is that major depressive disorder, for example, can be as severe, if not more so. Certain kinds of anxiety disorders can be as severe in terms of the level of distress and impairment produced. Or to put it another way, there's nothing special about PTSD when it comes to the severity of distress and impairment. It, however, can become very important in terms of causation. And in reference to that, let's go to slide number 5, please. Slide number 5 reflects really a common misunderstanding, which is quite common amongst certain unsophisticated mental health providers. Sometimes mental health providers will essentially diagnose PTSD if a patient comes in and reports that they were, quote, traumatized, or uses synonymous type of language. That represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what is diagnostically required to potentially suffer this disorder. Most of you are probably familiar with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're up to the 5th edition. And essentially, the very beginning of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD is a gatekeeper, a threshold. An individual must objectively, in fact, not just in perception or in feeling, but objectively, in fact, be exposed to, in one fashion or another, a particular type of life event. Now, there can be debate as to the magnitude of that kind of event, and that itself is can be a lengthy discussion. I would only say this as a guideline. For those who are interested in what kind of workplace events, for example, potentially qualify as a PTSD-inducing event. I recommend highly looking at not just the bullet points that identify the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but the examples that are used in the text as of the kind of events that may produce PTSD. So some of the examples include rape, being a prisoner of war, combat, individuals who were in concentration camps. So these are, and the list is not intended to be exhaustive, but the examples are there for a reason. They're there because the fundamental concept of PTSD is that when exposed to a particular magnitude of event under a certain set of circumstances, a significant percentage of the population will potentially develop PTSD. The bottom line point is the trauma in PTSD is not satisfied by the perception that there was a trauma, no matter how genuinely experienced that may be. It requires an assessment of objectively, essentially, what was the level of threat to which an individual was exposed. Traditionally, that level of threat was considered one that constituted, a threat to life or to produce serious injury. The DSM currently is a little bit more ambiguous regarding that, but I think a fair and reasonable test of a potential PTSD-inducing stressor is whether it's reasonable that whatever the asserted event was would potentially lead to some type of significant threat to bodily integrity. So, for example, the brushing, the massaging of an individual's shoulder. It in and of itself may be unwanted, may be inappropriate, but it would be hard to reasonably argue that by itself, that type of event was in any fashion comparable to being in fact raped or having a gun pointed at one's head and told if you don't give over your money, you're going to be shot. The belief that that massage would then lead to further and significant type of sexual touching, in and of itself, unless there is a very good reason to believe that, be it or but for some type of intervention, the massage on the shoulder would have led to substantially greater sexual contact. Unless that were established, it would be extremely difficult, and I would argue in most instances inappropriate, to assert that that was the basis essentially for producing a post-traumatic stress disorder. Obviously, more can be said about this, but why don't we go, for the sake of time, to slide number 6, please. Good. Slide number 6, causation fundamental issues. I will just make one point here. Obviously, the chronology of or timing of the onset of psychiatric symptoms or distress is a relevant consideration when considering causation. If a person only first developed a constellation of symptoms after an asserted wrong, it's reasonable to ask the question, did the asserted wrong produce the combination of symptoms from which an individual suffers? The important point is, although chronology is important and suggestive, it's not necessarily definitive. And that's for a number of reasons, but again, for the sake of time, I'll just mention 2. One which is very important and a fundamental part of a forensic psychiatric assessment, and that is that one or more intervening stressors, which may or may not have been identified by a certain point in the case, may be responsible for some or all of an individual's psychiatric symptomatology. And more subtly, a person can suffer from a pre-existing condition, which by its biological nature recurs at particular points in time and would be reasonably likely to spontaneously do so at a particular point in time. Of course, the only way to know that is to really obtain a very good psychiatric history, but there are conditions which do, by their very nature, repeatedly occur. And of course, I don't want to leave a simplistic impression of this. An individual can suffer from a biologically based recurrent disorder, for example, a recurrent mood disorder, but a specific episode of that disorder can be triggered by a particular life event, whether it's the claimed alleged wrong or some type of independent variable. And if we have time, we'll come back to how to assess that. Let's go to slide number 7, which is particularly important because it goes to evaluation methodology. Obviously, any kind of opinion that is rendered by an expert must be one which is reliable. Now, the reliability of an opinion to a very large extent depends upon the methodology that is utilized in the assessment. Incorrect methodology obviously renders an evaluator susceptible to forming an incorrect understanding. So I think it's very important for any attorney, regardless of which side he is or she is working on, to assess the methodology that was used by the expert. Now, forensic psychiatric or forensic psychological methodology of evaluation does in certain ways fundamentally differ from that used for the purposes of treatment. In treatment, as many of you well know, it's often taught, and it is understandable, to accept the patient's reporting of particular events as true, unless it's obvious or becomes obvious that the patient is psychotic and grossly out of touch with reality. So essentially, a patient, a person who seeks treatment, their narrative of events is often accepted inherently as fact. The patient's narrative may be psychologically and emotionally true to the patient, but is not necessarily an accurate reflection of objective or external reality. It's not, and many treaters will say to an extent, but not fully correctly, it's not their job to know what in fact occurred, although to be effective as a therapist, it's obviously not beneficial to reinforce a narrative brought by a patient which is actually skewed and not accurate. Forensic psychiatrist or psychologist fundamentally differs in their assessment methodology from a treater by their emphasis on attempting to obtain as much independent collateral data, i.e., data separate and apart from what an individual relates to their therapist or relates directly to a forensic evaluator, a forensic psychiatrist or psychologist. It's clear that in participation in legal settings may influence the way in which an individual reports information. In some instances, of course, it may cause an individual to knowingly or intentionally misrepresent aspects of his or her mental state or misrepresent aspects of his or her life experience that may be relevant to assessing causation of the individual's mental state. More subtly, because of the powerful emotional forces that are often present, particularly in employment discrimination cases, how people remember things and how they assign blame may be influenced by the various pressures that are simply part of the litigation process. In other words, an individual may not lie and may not intentionally misrepresent, but the way they recall certain events or the emphasis they put on some events versus others may be unwittingly shaped to an extent by the litigation process. So essentially, independent corroborative data focuses on does the person being evaluated in fact suffer from the presence of reported symptoms, and equally importantly, the magnitude and impairment that may be reported to be produced by those symptoms. It's very easy for an individual to come to a forensic evaluation and say, I'm very sad and appear sad. It's very easy for an individual to say, I'm having recurrent nightmares. That may be true. It may not be true. The issue is there methodology that will help reliably know whether, in fact, that is true? And that really requires sophisticated use of independent collateral data. The other major reason, and there is more than one reason, but the other major importance of independent collateral data really goes to causation, specifically identification of potential independent stressors, event-independent stressors that may, not necessarily did, but may have caused or significantly contributed to the individual's mental state. It's not unusual for an individual to believe that all of their distress comes from event X, when in fact their mental distress may be a function of event X, but also event Y and Z, and they don't appreciate the various factors which are responsible for their mental state. If an evaluee appears at an examination and doesn't identify potentially important independent stressors that require evaluation, the only way to know in a reliable way whether such stressors are in fact present is reviewing records that might reveal them. Of course, the first step is to identify those stressors, and then two, to assess whether or to what extent they played a role in producing the individual's mental state. Let's go to slide 8 just very briefly. Slide 8 really addresses a very large and often contentious issue, and that is what is the appropriate scope of a forensic psychiatric or psychological evaluation, or if it's a Rule 35 examination, are there areas of inquiry that are considered not to be appropriate? I won't answer that question in a detailed way. I will simply say this, that what may seem to be logical when it comes to assessing causation from a legal perspective oftentimes does not comport with what is standard practice, whether it be for treatment, for evaluation for the purpose of treatment, or evaluation for the purpose of attempting to answer a forensic psychiatric issue. So just one brief example. It may be asserted that inquiring about an individual's mental state 5 or more years prior to a particular alleged wrong is not something that should be permitted during an examination, because the issue at hand is what happened at, for example, the particular workplace, and what occurred for the person's mental state 5 or more years before then is not relevant. That does make certain sense from a legal perspective, but it doesn't reflect the way in which an appropriate evaluation is done psychiatrically. It's standard and, in fact, necessary practice to take a complete psychiatric history. If someone came to a physician and brought it in to whether it's a cardiologist or a psychiatrist, to not ask about a history of chest pain and only ask about chest pain that was experienced within the recent past would potentially border, depending on the situation, of course, on medical negligence. It's a very different thing if a person has had 1 episode of major depression in their life or 3 episodes of major depression. Such is very important to determining prognosis and the type of treatment that would be given, and ultimately potentially to the causation of any particular single episode. So the bottom line point, again, because of limited time, is that the standard of evaluation in a forensic setting, if one is to attempt to reach an accurate understanding, really is no less than what the type of inquiries should be for evaluation in any other setting. Conversely, as I've already mentioned, but it's worth remembering, there are specific kinds of inquiries that are part of a forensic psychiatric or psychological evaluation that are not part of a standard evaluation for the purpose of treatment. So I am going to briefly go to slide 9, which I've just incorporated largely in my comments. Let me see if I can, in fact, advance to that. Okay. Let me make a few comments about the methodology that a forensic psychiatrist or psychologist would use to determine whether reported symptoms are present, and if so, to what extent. So I am going to skip to the next slide. Now, let me emphasize an important point, that determining the genuine presence, severity, and ultimately origin of symptoms is equally important in an evaluation that a forensic psychiatrist or psychologist would perform for a plaintiff's attorney as it is for a defense attorney. Obviously, there always is the question of malingering, which we'll talk about more, but I'll just define it now. Malingering is the intentional, so I emphasize intentional, either fabrication or purposeful exaggeration of either a condition or symptoms of a condition for identifiable rational gain. So it's equally important if an individual genuinely does have certain symptoms for a forensic expert to assess whether malingering is present and to conclude potentially, if certain symptoms are present, that they are not in fact malingered. Conversely, obviously, it's equally important to know whether symptoms are being fabricated or exaggerated. And I will tell you that in my experience, cases generally don't get to me if it's obvious that someone is largely fabricating their mental state. More often, at least in the type of cases that I see and my colleagues often see, the issue is exaggeration of certain kinds of symptoms, and then secondarily, or equally importantly, whether the causation of such is what's being stated. So let's look at the slide for a moment, because I think it's important for attorneys to understand what the limits of a forensic psychiatric evaluation are, and therefore, again, the importance in most cases of obtaining and reviewing substantial independent collateral data. So nightmares, which I've mentioned before. Anybody can come into an evaluation and say, I'm having nightmares. Unless someone is reporting nightmares in a way that is largely psychiatrically impossible, just by examination, it's very difficult to know, A, whether the person in fact is having nightmares, and B, in some instances, perhaps more importantly, what is the content of the nightmares? Because, for example, it's relevant if the content of the nightmares there's no understandable connection with an asserted wrong. A person can have nightmares, but they may not necessarily emanate from what is asserted to be their cause. And there are ways to potentially assess whether nightmares are present. They include, for example, obviously, looking at all mental health treatment records from all providers. And I will emphasize that those records should never be limited to a summary of treatment that is provided by an evaluator. I treat patients as well, so I very well understand a therapist's desire to protect the privacy of their patients. Nonetheless, the raw data is what is necessary for an evaluation. Diminished libido. Obviously, any individual can walk into a forensic psychiatrist's office and say, I have little to no interest in sex anymore. And then the question is that in fact true? And the short answer as to how to establish that, in addition to mental health treatment records, is looking at records of all physicians, all medical providers that an individual has seen, which includes particularly, obviously in this kind of case, looking at gynecological records. So for example, if an individual was recently prescribed birth control medication, that might suggest that a person is sexually active and wants to obviously protect against pregnancy, although it's not necessarily as simple as that, because birth control medication can be used to treat certain medical conditions. So really looking at being a physician, looking at gynecological records, and looking additionally at pharmacy records to see what kinds of medications are being prescribed and why is very important. Of course, many in the audience have probably thought certainly an individual's spouse or partner can be interviewed, and that is something which is commonly, although not necessarily done. Obviously, in part, it depends upon the willingness of the other party to be interviewed. And even if that person is willing, obviously a forensic psychiatrist has to understand motivations of people when they're reporting certain symptoms. So if there's a gain that a spouse may potentially derive from reporting certain difficulties, that must be considered. On the other hand, just because there is a potential gain doesn't mean that the person is misreporting. It means that a sophisticated forensic psychiatrist needs to consider those possibilities, or conversely, for example, on cross-examination, if those kinds of considerations have not been part of the thought processes of the evaluating forensic psychiatrist, it would reasonably raise questions about the reliability of the evaluation. I won't say more about that at the moment, and I apologize that I jumped some slides, but just some other examples which I'll briefly mention. Headaches. I'll give you an example of type of collateral data that might be helpful in establishing whether headaches are genuinely present, or if present, significantly present. If a person reports that they've developed, for example, terrible tension headaches as a physical expression of traumatic stress, and it can be helpful to find out the frequency and circumstances of those headaches, and to then explore an individual's employment records, see if there are absences or descriptions of the need to take a break from workplace responsibilities, for example, to go into a quiet, dark room, etc., that would be consistent with the headaches that are reported by the individual, and so on. There are many examples of this, but essentially the mantra of a reliable forensic psychiatric evaluation should be to ask the question: if the person asserts that certain symptoms are present, how would those symptoms expectedly manifest in various spheres of the person's life? And then what kind of documents would independently demonstrate such, as well as what kinds of inquiries can be made during a forensic psychiatric evaluation to determine such. So I'll just take a moment to give a graphic example of such. And this is what I call really psychological fingerprints. The person has a particular problem or symptoms. What are the fingerprints that it leaves in the person's life, and how can one establish such? And again, this is equally important in evaluations that are done for plaintiffs claiming damages, as well as those who are defending against them. So a brief vignette is of an individual who I examined years ago, who was claiming that he was severely depressed from allegedly being discriminated against on the basis of age at his workplace. and he reported that he had trouble getting out of bed in the morning, which can be a genuine symptom of major depression, and that he had lost interest in activities, few things brought him pleasure, etc. And in my discussion of hobbies, I learned that he had been an avid tennis player, but he reported to me, consistent with what would be major depression, that he had stopped playing tennis because he lacked the desire and energy to do so. Subsequently, and this is what I mean by independent collateral data, his attendance records at the tennis club where he played tennis were obtained. Every time that he would go there to play doubles, he would the members would swipe, and therefore there would be a record of attendance. And it turned out that the frequency with which he was playing tennis after the onset of his reported major depressive symptoms was almost virtually identical to what it was before he reported the onset of these symptoms and the associated alleged discrimination. So obviously, his mental state was not as dire as he reported, and his reporting something in such a significantly discordant way reasonably raises questions about the reliability of the individual's reporting. So the next slide that I put up, still under assessment methodology, we don't have time to talk about the universe of kinds of records that can be important to establishing the genuine presence, severity, and cause of an individual's problems. I will just emphasize what it says here. Records, 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 and I will go over this very quickly. Medical records. They really are important for a number of reasons. So, for example, most of the antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication prescribed in the United States is not prescribed by psychiatrists. It's prescribed by primary care practitioners and internists. So to both reliably establish the kind of treatment someone may be getting presently, but also to reliably establish whether there was a pre-existing relevant psychiatric condition, it becomes very important to get an individual's medical records. I will advance to the next slide, and there are other reasons which you can read on the slide on your own. Pharmacy records are extremely important. For example, one of the issues for a forensic psychiatric or psychological evaluator, but particularly when it comes to medication, obviously a forensic psychiatrist, is what is the prognosis for recovery? If a person, and well, let me take a half step back. The number one reason why individuals don't respond to treatment is lack of compliance. Patients, unfortunately, not uncommonly, will tell their doctors that they're taking the medication exactly as prescribed, the exact dose at the exact frequency, when in fact, particularly when it comes, for example, to antidepressants, because of a misunderstanding or fear of side effects, etc., individuals may come to take the antidepressant only when they feel particularly badly. That's not an uncommon report. But antidepressants don't work effectively unless they're taken regularly. The only way to potentially know how compliant an individual is with treatment is pharmacy records. Pharmacy records are important for other things because obviously various medications can produce side effects which sometimes mimic psychiatric symptoms. Sometimes learning all of the medications that someone is taking can enlighten the evaluator as to whether there are other medical disorders which are relevant either physically or psychologically to understanding someone's mental state. It's generally true and doesn't in any way reflect necessarily lying or purposeful obfuscation that it can be difficult for an individual to accurately remember all of the medications they've gotten over the years and what the dosing has been. So pharmacy records can be very important. Obviously, if someone is claiming disability or significant impairment, both current and, I'll emphasize, past disability claims become important. I'm going to move on because of time, so bear with me. From assessing damages to causation, I'll make just one brief comment regarding damages. A major error that is often made in terms of prognosis is an expert's lack of knowledge as to what is generally accepted evidence-based treatment for a particular condition. And this includes both medication, which means not only the correct medication, it means the correct dosing, it means the correct duration of use of the medication. It's equally true for psychotherapy. For example, PTSD. One of the two gold standard treatments for PTSD is what's called exposure treatment. And there are variants of that. But it's unfortunate, but true in America, that many therapists just aren't trained in how to utilize exposure treatment. So unfortunately, patients with genuine PTSD commonly don't get what is considered gold standard treatment. And obviously, if someone hasn't had the benefit of such treatment, it is relevant to assessing their prognosis. This is not an issue of medical or psychotherapist malpractice. It's an issue of the ability to make a reliable or to provide a reliable opinion about prognosis based upon knowledge of what is appropriate treatment and whether it has been received. I'll mention one thing in passing, and that is, which I've referenced already, you can see on the slide, that forensic psychiatrists are taught in their training programs. I teach forensic psychiatrists myself. That a standard part of any forensic psychiatric evaluation when assessing causation is, again, to investigate the potential presence of independent stressors and then the potential effect of such. So some certain common ones, unfortunately, include domestic violence, because there is, unfortunately, a significant amount of that in American society. Obviously, significant independent financial problems can be stressful. Deaths or serious illnesses of loved ones can be significant. And you can look at the slides, and I identify in the slides a number of both independent stressors that are commonly and appropriately inquired about. And again, whether the exam is for plaintiff or defense, the forensic psychiatrist, using appropriate methodology, needs to inquire about these. These are not something which are asked for one set of examinations, but not another. And the same regarding trauma history. So let's talk about perception. And let me reiterate an important statement that I made before, and I think many people who work in this field, many attorneys who work in this field, understand this well. And that is, generally in life, perception, how we interpret events, can as much as, if not more than, the objective characteristics of an event determine an individual's emotional reaction to it. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because it goes to the issue of causation. Obviously, being exposed to a particular type of wrongful, objectively significantly stressful event may produce, although not necessarily will produce, but may produce a psychiatric disorder. But an individual also can develop a psychiatric disorder based on a good faith, genuinely held, but distorted perception of what the individual has been exposed to. So for the sake of teaching, let me just give you a dramatic example to make the point. An individual who is grossly paranoid, who has the delusion, a false fixed belief that there is a conspiracy by all men who are 5'6", wearing black raincoats and hats, are carrying guns under their coats and are there as part of a plot to kill that person. So as a result, the individual who believes that is having trouble sleeping at night because they think they're being subjected to a threat to their life. They may develop nightmares of men wearing these coats and hats because this is the subject of their fear. They may start to avoid certain areas because this is where they see men dressed in this manner congregating. For example, maybe more in the financial district of a town where people are more formally dressed. The individual might start being preoccupied with distressing, intrusive thoughts of these people because it is distressing to believe that one is being subjected to this kind of threat. So an individual, in short, may develop all of the symptoms of a post-traumatic stress disorder, or many of them, I should say more accurately, without objectively, in fact, being exposed to an event which actually threatened their life or serious physical well-being, or seriously threatened their physical well-being or integrity. Now, when might the cause of an individual's distress largely, if not entirely, be a function of, again, genuinely held but distorted perception of events? An important hint of such, not proof of such, just a hint that would indicate consideration of the role of perception should be seriously investigated, would be if the claims that an individual has made were accepted as, in fact, entirely true. Would they typically cause the level of seemingly genuine distress and impairment manifested by the individual? Typically, if there is a significant mismatch between the level of objective adverse experience and the degree of associated genuine, not malingered, psychiatric disorders, oftentimes, not necessarily, but oftentimes there will be some type of psychological mediator which is internally based and is the causative agent of the development of the disorder. And there are two general kinds of causative agents which transform certain kinds of events, which I will use a legal term, but ultimately this is a determination for a jury, but I will use the term a reasonable person in a generic rather than legal fashion. If a reasonable, psychologically reasonable person were exposed to certain events, one wouldn't necessarily expect, for example, the full-blown symptomatology of post-traumatic stress disorder and major depressive disorder to result. However, if someone is perceiving the events through a distorting lens, the distorting lens, which is internally based, might explain the level of psychiatric disorder the person suffers. So two kinds of mental disorders which may predate the events, not necessarily render an individual vocationally impaired or disabled, but in the right set of circumstances, transform a certain kind of experience into a certain kind of disorder would be personality disorders. The most common ones would be a paranoid personality disorder, which is not a disorder that causes someone to be psychotic or grossly out of touch with reality. It means that there's a certain spin that a person tends to put on things. They tend to over-personalize and over-attribute some type of malice to actions. So an action may be an adverse action, but the person is biased in interpreting the adverse action as directed towards them and motivated by malice. Now, of course, the action could in fact be directed towards them and a function of malice, but a person who who tends to be paranoid would be prone to believe that regardless. And many of you have probably heard of borderline personality disorder, which is another kind of disorder which is relevant. We don't have time to fully review it. Another one which commonly overlaps borderline personality disorder is narcissistic personality disorder. And I will simply say this. The person with a narcissistic personality tends to have difficulty assigning causation. These are people who typically, despite their bombast, have a very fragile self-esteem. So to protect their fragile self-esteem, they need to find some kind of external reason, something outside of themselves that explains their disappointment, why they haven't achieved as much in their life, why they haven't progressed to a certain level of status, etc. So they will genuinely have difficulty recognizing whether they've contributed to certain difficulties in their life and would be prone potentially to include discrimination as an external cause, even if that may or may not be the case. The paranoid person would, again, tend to see malice that may not be present. I won't mention delusional disorders because, although true, not sufficiently common to discuss. So the other issue, the other condition that may be transformative, in other words, transform an external event into a mental disorder, would be if a person suffered significant childhood trauma, which affected the way in which the individual as an adult perceives certain kinds of stimuli. So it doesn't mean that the individual necessarily, generally, distortedly perceives events, but there could be certain kinds of language, certain kinds of touches that even without conscious awareness, push the button of remembrance of what happened in the past, and therefore take on, from a psychological perspective, much greater weight and meaning. So to end before questions, I mentioned early on that a massage to an individual's shoulder that went no further in terms of touching, and there was no reasonable basis for believing was the first step in a progression towards a sexual assault, would not qualify as an event which could produce, by definition, a post-traumatic stress disorder. But for the child, for example, who was sexually abused by, for example, their uncle, and the uncle typically began the sequence of escalation of sexual assault by massaging the shoulder, that massage may have very special and anxiety-inducing power to the individual, resulting, depending upon other factors, in a exaggerated, distorted perception and reaction, which is genuine to the person, but really is a function not of their current circumstances, but really the past unwittingly manifesting, which is one of the reasons, for example, that taking a complete psychiatric history, including a trauma history, is not only standard practice when it comes to treating an individual, it's standard practice when conducting a forensic evaluation when assessing potentially emotional distress damages or causation. I see that it's 3 o'clock. I don't know. I'm certainly happy for a few minutes to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kleinman. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode, which is psychiatric, and any questions that you have for Dr. Kleinman. We only have time enough for one question, so all unanswered questions will go directly to Dr. Kleinman to contact you to answer. Question. Is there any recognition of ongoing traumatic stress disorder regarding certain stressful top-down coercive places of employment?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure. Is there any recognition of ongoing traumatic stress disorder regarding certain stressful top-down coercive places of employment?
Well, I'll answer as best I can because, I'm sorry, it's on the screen, so that's helpful. Bear with me 1 second. I don't think I can accurately answer that question because I am not sure that I fully understand the term top-down coercive places. I don't know if that has a particular legal meaning or is used specifically in a certain context. And without understanding that, I can't answer the question. More generally, I can say that it's generally true, but importantly, not always true, that greater objectively greater magnitude stressors are more likely to produce a traumatic stress disorder, although, on the other hand, because of resilience, there are individuals who can be exposed to almost the worst of the worst and surprisingly suffer minimum psychiatric consequences. I think that's the best answer I can give in a short amount of time.
Thanks, Dr. Kleinman. And again, all unanswered questions will go directly to Dr. Kleinman for answering. Please remember that if you're applying for CLE credit, you must have attended for the full 60 minutes of this presentation. You're also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Dr. Kleinman for his time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Dr. Kleinman, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. And just a reminder that all certificates will be emailed directly to you in 24 to 48 hours. This concludes our program for today.